Association of Canada's panel discussion, recognition of International Women's Day. I'm Indira Naidu-Harris, a director on the NATO Association of Canada board, and I can't tell you how pleased I am to be here with you all today for this important and timely conversation. Our discussion today is titled Building Resilience, Women's Leadership Against Violent Extremism. You see, this is an incredibly important moment in time. We are witnessing firsthand a series of troubling events around the world that could have serious consequences on our future. Our world is becoming more complex, polarized, and unpredictable. And as we are being hit by wars, uncertainty, and global instability, research shows that violent extremism is on the rise, a troubling development. You see, more and more often, violence is being used to achieve extreme ideological, religious, or political goals. Just think about that and what that means. And this rise in extremism is putting more and more countries and more of us at risk of terrorist and extremist attacks. So, what can we do to prevent violent extremism from taking root? And how can we make our communities and our countries resilient and safe from these attacks? Well, today we are going to find out. That's because we are going to take a closer look at the troubling rise in extremism around the world, what that means for all of us, and the unique leadership role women can play in prevention and the building of resiliency to these attacks. You see, while women are often looked as being victims sometimes or even supporters of violent extremism, it is becoming increasingly clear that we can also be part of the solution in the fight against extremism. So today, we are going to take some time to reflect and discuss the important role women can play in building security and peace. Here with us now to tell us more about building resilience and the leadership role women can play against violent extremism are Dr. Cecile Rousseau and Dr. Ardath Whynacht. Dr. Rousseau is a professor at McGill University's Division of Social and Cultural Psychiatry and holds a Canada Research Chair in the Prevention of Violent Radicalization. Her research focuses on intervention and prevention programs to address social polarization and violent radicalization. She is also a member of the Canadian Practitioners Network on the prevention of radical and extremist violence. Welcome, Doctor. Also joining us is Dr. Ardath Whynacht. Dr. Whynacht is a professor at Mount Allison University. Her research focuses on mental health, violence, and social transformation. So important. She is recognized for her experience and her expertise in transformative approaches to family and state violence. Her work focuses on feminist, community-based strategies that address the social conditions actually linked to violent extremism while promoting care and justice for marginalized communities. So I want to say welcome to you both. Great to have you both here. Also here today to talk about and to take us through this remarkable conversation with our panelists are Selena Khan and Soha Sarfraz. Selena and Soha are members of the NATO Association of Canada team, and they will guide us through this important conversation. Welcome, everyone. Good to have you here. So I am going to kick things off this morning by asking the first question, if everyone's okay with that. Dr. Rousseau, I'm going to start with you. Dr. Rousseau, tell me, why is it important for us to discuss violent extremism and radicalization right now? And from a gender perspective, tell me, are women uniquely positioned and qualified to help us deal with this troubling issue?
Thank you, Indira. A very, very important and I would say broad question. So why should we consider gender when we talk about violent extremism? In a nutshell, I would propose 3 avenues today, and of course there are much more. they're much more object of direct violence. They also are targeted by blame and stigma, and I'll come back to that. And their voice and agency is underrepresented, and I think we should promote that. So let's go back to direct consequences. Presently, as you said, violent extremism is on the rise. In Canada, use of the major trends, and in the US, they would talk about homegrown terrorism, is alt-right, neo-Nazi, extreme right movements. Doesn't mean religious extremism is not present, but all these forms of extremism are tightly linked with forms of masculinism. And the first victim are women and women's rights. And we have a rise presently of conjugal violence. We have a rise in feminicides. We have a rise in fear in women. We have a rise in misogyny in our schools. All of that is, so the toll, the price to pay is overly high for women. And I think that this is the first poignant fact that we should consider. The second thing I wanted to bring is the issue of blame and stigma. When we have violent extremism, people will often, and just reviewed very interesting research on that in Tunisia, Italy, and Canada, blame the mothers. It's because of the mothers. The mother will create the terrorist, and then the mother should find the problem and solve the problem. So women are both responsible for extremism and terrorism and supposed to be the solution. Just to make clear, that's not new. Women have been accused of being responsible for autism, for schizophrenia, so the historical trends, it's always the fault of women and of mothers. But it's, I'm not saying, of course, that women are not part of the solution, but I'm saying that they are also overrepresented in terms of blame and stigma, even if they're not at the forefront in terms of being the actors of violent extremism, because at that level, men are overrepresented. And maybe the last point that I wanted to bring, and it's absolutely not exhaustive, is that in terms of voice and agency, there is a tendency, and we have to see that extremism now is not only produced by small, diverging and illegal group, but could be state-sponsored and is increasingly so. And women are often portrayed as fragile being which needs to be protected. And I'm not against protection for women, but I think that the tendency to portray them as vulnerable beings who need to be protected is also a way to deny them a voice and an agency and a capacity to choose and have a say in the social space. And I think we have to be very careful as we're being in a world where this tendency are growing to make sure that we protect this right for women in Canada.
So much to think about, and thank you so much for sharing that. And very interesting to hear your thoughts about the fact that women have a dual role in this conversation, both as folks who are vulnerable to much of what is happening when it comes to violent extremism, but also are able to be actors in terms of finding solutions. And I think this year's International Women's Day, the UN theme of rights, justice, action for all women and girls is something that makes this particular conversation when we're talking about justice so much more important and women's rights in this conversation. And sorry to take away from you, Dr. Whynacht. I'm happy to come to you now and find out your thoughts on this. Again, is it important for us to discuss violent extremism and radicalization from a gender perspective? Tell me why.
Yeah, so I mean, I definitely agree with all of Dr. Rousseau's comments. I think, that was a beautiful primer on three really important avenues that emphasize a need for a gendered analysis on extremist violence. But I think, personally, my short answer is that we need gendered analysis when we're trying to think through violence prevention and response, because gender itself is being weaponized largely by far-right extremist groups, which are, of course, transnational, but have been fairly firmly rooted here in Canada, since quite far back, but in terms of the data we have since the 1990s. So, we know from published analysis of quantitative data sets on far-right severe violence in Canada that violence perpetrated by those who are motivated by ultranationalism and racism are really, as what Dr. Rousseau has said, masculinist in their attitudes, but that itself is underpinned by a very rigid understanding of gender as a binary, which of course we know psychologically, biologically, socially, culturally, the binary itself is no longer accurate. And so, as Cecile has pointed out, there's really a strong ecosystem now in Canada and beyond of violent rhetoric connected to what's referred to as the anti-gender movement. And the on-ramp into this sort of movement often is transphobia, right? So transphobia is where we see sort of the cracks in the ecosystem of protection for women in women's spaces, where we're seeing like leakage of folks who are looking for more protection for women and children, more action on issues of family violence, which is my area of expertise. We're seeing those elements of transphobia really undermine how far those movements are able to go. And I want to give a very brief example, and I think this little anecdote might illustrate why we need a gendered lens when talking about violent extremism, but a gendered lens that isn't underpinned by a binary. So I am a queer scholar myself, and 2 years ago, I was heading down to City Hall to meet up with some folks that advocate for queer and trans youth in the city, because the Conservative Party of Canada had sort of spurned on and funded a bunch of signs and protest activity against what they called gender ideology in schools, which of course is a construction and a myth. So they were protesting sexual health education. And so we went down to raise our voice and say, we believe this is a hate movement. There's nothing going wrong in our schools. I was pregnant at the time. I was 7 months pregnant, had a tiny little rainbow flag. And when I went across the street to go down to City Hall to be with my colleagues from the feminist community, I became overwhelmed by a parade of protesters, mostly folks who were wearing Conservative Party of Canada hats, and also many newcomers, the majority of whom were very new newcomers who spoke only Farsi or Arabic, who were holding English language signs, protesting anti-gender ideology. And seeing me pregnant as a woman with my tiny little pride flag in the middle of the crowd, they began hitting me with these signs.
Oh, no.
And I think that this anecdote really illustrates the complexity of thinking through what a gendered lens could and should look like when we think about violent extremism, because in this one example, we have newcomers who are holding signs in a language that they don't even speak yet, paid for by actors of our state who are democratically elected. And we have, very small groups of people who understand what a gendered lens looks like very differently, facing violence in the street of what is usually a very safe town. And so, I offer this anecdote not to, try and capture everyone's attention so much, but to point out the complexities of gender, language, culture, and how we might move forward looking at the issues.
Thank you both for your comments and for, some of the observations and sharing your story. I have to say, the notion of gender being weaponized is certainly a conversation that's growing. It is very troubling. We heard Dr. Rousseau talk about the rise in misogyny in the last little while, and how that in many ways is also fueling some of these extremist behavior. These are times when we need to pay attention, especially this International Women's Day. And so, you know, I want to thank you both for being here today and sharing your thoughts with us as we continue, and certainly bringing what I can see is an intersectional lens to this conversation. So on that note, I am going to step back a little bit and give you, Selena and Soha, you two a chance to continue the conversation. But really very interested in hearing the observations and anecdotes that folks are going to be sharing with us. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Indira, for that kind introduction and the opening to our panel discussion. Good morning, everyone. My name's Selena Khan, and I'm an intern with the NATO Association of Canada, and I'm going to be leading us through the next few panel questions for our discussion today, really celebrating International Women's Day, but pushing into the deeper conversations that we need to have. And with that, we've had a wonderful kind of context building in terms of the gendered side of violent extremism. We're going to go into two specific questions, one for each of our speakers. So first, for Dr. Whynacht, your work primarily focuses on feminist community-based strategies, as we mentioned, for addressing the social conditions linked to violent extremism. What do you think those strategies look like in practice? Is there anything more you can explain to us about that?
Yeah, so much of my work, both in community and as a researcher, focuses on intimate partner homicide and domestic homicide. So I widen my lens a little bit from looking at femicide to thinking through also casualties of children and other family members during family violence homicides. I also do work on mass casualty events as well, and sort of taking a critical social and cultural lens to some of the ways that we talk about violent perpetrators within the fields of forensic psych and within public safety literature. So that's sort of where I'm coming from. You know, the good news is from the 2 decades of work I've been doing on this, it's abundantly clear and a consensus is emerging that the same tools that we need to address femicides and family violence homicides are the same tools in many ways that can address mass casualty perpetrators and reduce and prevent violence on that front as well. And so some of the strategies that I advocate for, in fact, almost all of the strategies I advocate for are civil society-based strategies. This being because, you know, as I mentioned in the introduction, a career in policing and also in the Canadian Armed Forces can be very seductive, specifically to men who have strong right-wing ideologies, who are tempted by right-wing extremism. And we know, because of investigations as far back as 1997 in Somalia, that, you know, the Canadian Armed Forces has a right-wing extremism problem within and amongst its own members. And we know that that is also a problem in both national policing, the RCMP, and municipal policing. We also know that police officers are more likely to engage in gender-based violence. And so when we look at all of the institutions and systems that we task nationally with addressing, preventing, and responding to acts of violence, whether it's intimate and within the home, or whether it's large scale, like the Port-à-Pique mass casualty event we had here in Mi'kma'ki a few years ago, those institutions tend to have folks who are similar in some ways to the folks who are perpetrating violence. And so that is a problem for women. It's a problem for their children. It's a problem for survivors. And those institutions, and this is the explanation for why, you know, after decades of investment in policing first strategies to reduce violence against women, we really haven't seen a reduction, specifically in intimate partner homicide. And in fact, the numbers have been going up recently. So that's why I turn to civil society. And I think, you know, the role that civil society organizations can play, and this isn't just anti-violence organizations, but also thinking through community centers, cultural associations, even clubs and groups within local schools, high schools, and junior highs. These organizations have the ability to teach curriculum and to create safe spaces for transformative education, and can really address some of those risk factors that make violent extremist ideologies very seductive. Civil society organizations tend to already be rooted within and trusted by those who are most vulnerable to perpetrating those acts, and also those who are likely to be survivors of it. Unfortunately, our civil society sector tends to receive the lowest amount of funding and support. But for example, I was part of a recent project in Ontario that brought together folks from across civil society, community centers, sports associations, domestic violence crisis shelters to look at transformative justice models of reducing family violence homicides. And, what we saw when we brought together civil society to all collaborate on violence prevention, across the board in every tiny little corner of our community, we saw movement and education and transformative education really building momentum in the province. And Ontario's the first province to bring together, a whole of civil society approach on violence prevention in this way. It was a very small pilot, but, it left me feeling very positive and optimistic about the future of cross-sectoral organizing between both volunteer-led groups and also funded groups within the civil society sector. So I can get more specific, but I'm also interested in hearing more about what Dr. Rousseau has to say on this question as well.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was such an incredible response, especially because it really does demonstrate how the small local scale strategies can be our bigger, larger international and national scale strategies. And it really is that education aspect as well, which is a big part of what the NATO Association is focused on, is educating, as we are doing here today. So next we'll turn it to Dr. Rousseau. I've got a specific question for her, but she can also, you're welcome to comment on anything Dr. Whynacht said. The question I do have for you kind of builds on this, as you've mentioned that your work informs the intersectoral policy approaches. Could you explain what that means in practice and which sectors need to be involved?
Well, I think it builds very, very well on what Dr. Whynacht just said. One of the things which happened with violent extremism and violence in general is that it elicits fear and the illusion that we should prevent the risk by securitizing society. And we're doing that a lot, and it has good and bad consequences. So security actors are, of course, needed in this conversation, but the fact that violence prevention become their turf has become a problem, and that is related to what Ardath was saying. Why? Because it's utterly dangerous to punish despair. Punishing despair creates more despair, more rage, and more violence. And presently, mass violence in Canada and in the States is mostly acted upon by what we call lone actors, influenced, of course, by ideology or by nihilism, which is also kind of very important, and increasingly by very young actors. So think of the very recent drama of Tumbler Ridge. Sadly, we should ask ourselves, could it have been prevented? And the answer is yes. And this is why intersectoral action is absolutely needed. It would have been good to have the education system involved. It would have been absolutely essential to have the health system involved. It would have been absolutely essential to have the municipality, the neighborhood, the communities involved, and of course the security forces. But you see, this is what the kind of interactor work, consultation that we need to have. And it's difficult because we have different mandates. We have different views of things. We have divergent views. We have conflicts. We have critique to each other. And these are important because if the action is under the hat of security or just under the hat of health, it's distorted. So our divergence inform action. Let me give you an example. Presently, we have a very rapid upsurge of minor offenders, young adolescents, majority of boys, as young as 12 and 13. So last week we had this consultation in Quebec with RCMP, youth judges, prosecutors, lawyers, DYP, health institutions, education institution, and we need all these people to say, okay, what is, so treating these kids as adults will not solve the problem. You're bulldozing the problem to a few years later. This will make things worse. It will put oil on the fire. So how do we address from a reintegration perspective? And I do like the idea of the reparative justice. How do we address the judicial process for a 12-year-old? How do we take in account the developmental perspective? If we do not do that, how do we promote prevention initiatives in school, which are not about targeting dangerous individuals? We know that doesn't work. Since Columbine, we know it doesn't work. So you see, intersectoral action is about coming together with different mandates and working on our differences, on our conflict, as informing action, not as something which needs to be suppressed.
Wow, that was truly a very good response. Your knowledge is incredible, so I really appreciate you being here. Identifying those elements and how it takes a collaborative and informed approach to really push forward preventative approaches to violent extremism is incredible. So we will move to the collective questions that we have for the both of you. Our first one would be, in either of your research or teachings, what misconceptions about women and extremism do you most often encounter? Now, either of you can respond, go back and forth. Maybe I'll pass it to Dr. Whynacht first. Any thoughts?
Actually, I'm going to be difficult. There's one more thing I want to say on the last question. Sorry, Selena.
Of course, go ahead.
It strikes me that the one thing we never talk about in terms of violence prevention in civil society and in intersectoral spaces is evidence-based violence prevention as well. And much of the research that I'm doing and that I'm reading and that I'm working on with my peers, almost all of whom are women in the field, really demonstrates that, again, the punitive approach. You know, this is such a beautiful quote, Dr. Rousseau, how dangerous it is to punish despair, how much evidence we have behind those assertions. And I just want to acknowledge the tremendous work that women are doing, turning out research that's not often listened to, but does provide us with evidence-based social policy, which is something we don't have enough of. In terms of misconceptions around extremism, and violence, you know, I think one, I'm working right now on a project across the country of looking at sort of visions of Indigenous justice in relation to the historical role of the RCMP in those communities. And I think one of the first things is that the police keep us safe. The men in uniforms keep us safe, and that's sort of the go-to only acceptable response. And that, you know, if you are a woman who is at risk from violence, if you don't follow that pathway, you know, you're not seen as credible, right? Well, did you call for help? Did you call police? But of course, we know, especially from the perspective of many Indigenous women in Canada, they've experienced violence both at the hands of the state through the residential school system, the 60 Scoop, and also through, situations we saw in Val d'Or, Quebec, systematic sexual violence at the hands of law enforcement as well. And so, you know, I think from the work that I'm doing in those communities, I think that's the first myth, is that, you know, as a woman, your claim to protection is only legitimate if you engage with the RCMP, and the misconception that is the only pathway to public safety, I think, is dangerous, because it erases all of the incredible public safety work that we do, you know, both paid and unpaid, as civilians and in communities. The other thing I think that's important to point out is that, you know, specifically in Canada and the UK and also in the United States, but Canada and the UK sort of share a lot of policy attention with each other, specifically around family violence policy. And the increase in transphobia in women's spaces has been really troubling over the last decade. And I think that, you know, there is a misconception that questioning the safety of having trans women present in traditionally cis women's spaces, that is somehow sort of a valid or legitimate claim and about safety. And so I think, you know, the misconception that this is sort of harmlessly engaging in a feminist act is very dangerous, because again, we know that transphobia is an on-ramp into often right-wing and other forms of extremist ideologies right now. It is sort of being weaponized in those ideological spaces. And what that does is it prevents a lot of feminist and women's spaces from really connecting the dots between private violence and large-scale acts of public violence, because our conversations get so bogged down in sort of what it means to be a woman, and who belongs there. And the misconception that, you know, someone like J.K. Rowling, for example, is harmless, and of course other folks within the anti-femicide community that have engaged in a lot of transphobia. So, you know, I think those are the two sort of largest misconceptions that I see. And the other thing is that I think that women are playing such a tremendous role in building safety in communities within community-based nonprofit organizations. You know, I'm thinking about the many organizations responding to the housing crisis, the opioid crisis, and sort of the multiple poly crises that we face in the West over the last 5 years. There's just tremendous amount of work being done to reduce despair and to provide safety and to transform some of those vulnerability conditions. And those jobs are, you know, they're underpaid. We know that women who are workers in those care sectors face really high rates of moral injury and burnout and occupational mental health injury. But, you know, in some of the research that I'm doing within those community-based organizations here in Atlantic Canada, we're seeing that they're making a tremendous difference. Although the burnout rate is high in those organizations, we're seeing they're making a tremendous difference in terms of improving mental health and well-being among our most vulnerable. So I do want to acknowledge the role that women are playing, you know, within those organizations as well.
Thank you so much. Do you have anything to add, Dr. Rousseau?
Maybe two small things, or not so small. One is a common misconception, and it's very, very common in the press presently, is that masculinist ideology is fueled by feminist ideology or as a reaction, and the data contradicts totally this assertion. You know, in Quebec and in Canada, the level of gender equality in some Canadian survey was really stable, with maybe 10% of the population promoting a more patriarchal system for almost 20 years. And just recently went up very rapidly, and especially in young men. This has nothing to do with feminist ideology. It has to do with economic uncertainty, with climate uncertainty, with our world changing, with identity threats, but not with feminism. So I think that that's the first misconception. The other, and I'll shift to, because your question made me think of that, to tertiary and secondary prevention, is that women are not well placed to address individual like incels or masculinist. And in our team, this is not true, and it's very interesting that when faced with people who have a tendency to dehumanize women, but maybe also stranger, racialized people, trans, or people from the LGBTQ, it doesn't mean that the person who is dehumanized cannot intervene. We had I had amazing conversation with masculinist pro-Andrew Tate men who were saying, but doctor, you need to understand me. Women are really inferior. They're really infantile and need a man to guide them. But that was a paradoxical situation, because the fact that they needed my approval was kind of contradicting their plea. And just the fact that I was listening to them as a human and humanizing and trying to understand why they were thinking this way kind of changes and shifted what was happening in the encounter.
Wow. See, these are such deep discussions. And honestly, I have to say that I really appreciate both those responses, and that this question was probably the most interesting for me to ask, just because it really is interesting to hear the gaps in what, from your educated perspectives, in what these areas hold. With International Women's Day, we should push even harder to break down stereotypes and false pretenses. So I do appreciate those insights. I do have another question that pushes a little bit further into the sphere of the NATO Association, and into our more national and international lens. So, what lessons can Canada offer NATO partners in terms of inclusive, gender-sensitive prevention strategies, whether those strategies are already in practice or simply a possible path at this point? And what lessons do you think Canada can still learn in those areas? So once again, both of you can answer. I don't know if anyone wants to go first.
It's interesting. We pause. I would say presently, which was going on in the world, we should both be conscious of some of the privileges and the chances we have, and be, I feel that it could be personal, very cautious before giving anybody a lesson. That's my feeling. I think presently, at the world level, democracy is shattered. But democracy is easier to maintain in times of affluence, relative affluence. And as the world is changing, and it will further change, we have to ask ourselves, how are we going to preserve what we cherish, which is democracy and relative equality, when resources are going to become more scarce? So I think it's a very timely question. Are we able to preserve the type of humanity we want to in hard time? It's very easy, to promote. Remember, after Second World War, the 30 years, which were called I just have the French word, les 30 glorieuses. So there was growth, there was immigration was considered a richness and so on, because there was this illusion of richness and equality goes hand in hand. We're facing limited resources in the next decades. For your generation, Selena and Soha, we're facing a planet which is not doing well. Are we going to be able to maintain what we cherish in a stormy time where there will be less for everybody?
Yes, those are really big, really big questions. I think I had to pause before answering this question, but I think there are a few fronts on which we can and should be really proud of work that's been done here in Canada. The first is that, this whole concept of transformative justice, which is a theme, borrowed largely from social workers in the 1980s, working within and against the prison system here in Canada. Those concepts were borrowed from traditional Indigenous value systems here across territories and across Indigenous nations. We, decades before the term became commonplace and written about in books, we had social workers and elders and community workers and youth workers doing something called family case conferencing, which was a way of working with folks in community outside of punishment models to address child sexual abuse, intimate and family violence, address ongoing mental health struggles within families that were leading to neglect and abuse in various ways. And as far back as the 1980s, these sorts of community-based interventions, which often brought in circles of support from, a teacher, extended family, neighbors, where the kids grew up together and were considered cousins. These sorts of interventions that were pioneered here were extremely effective in helping families heal and resolve, and they were also cost effective. And of course, we saw interventions like that continue within Correctional Services of Canada, running what's called COSA, circles of support and accountability for folks leaving prison with a sex offense, largely engaged in sexual violence. And those programs were extremely, extremely effective in reducing recidivism. So, and I raise that because I think it's important now in a time when, we will look back and call this, the Epstein era of our public consciousness, thinking about, we can talk about NATO, but NATO is also in the context of what we're understanding as a global class of wealthy folks who engage in violence against our most vulnerable and exploitation of our most vulnerable. And I just want to assert that, Canada is a place where we not only taught those who offended against children to not do it anymore, but we did it cost effectively and for many years. And of course, that program was cut under the Harper government regime, and it limps along in different jurisdictions, but it's here and it exists as a framework. And it is appropriate, I think, when we address microviolence and when we address relational despair, it's there that we can prevent large casualties and large tragedies that create collective despair. And we need those micro interventions. And I think those interventions come through resourcing youth work and resourcing our schools, because we cannot talk about prevention unless we take a good hard look at what our elected officials are spending on programs for youth. And those programs can't be resourced so tightly that their staff don't have enough hours in the day to go to workshops and panel discussions like this. So they need to have flexibility and elasticity to respond to the conditions that youth are facing. And, finally, I think, I mentioned this earlier, but I think really looking hard at the folks who are doing the care building and the community safety work in paid and unpaid contexts in our communities, whether they have these cool program tools at their disposal or not. I think we have to look at how do we support them? How do we support the folks who are doing those small scale micro interventions, make that work sustainable and livable, so that they can keep doing it and expand it slowly, jurisdiction by jurisdiction. And maybe that means looking at municipal level funding and smaller scale rollouts. And so I think, those are some pathways forward that I think we already have success here in Canada. And again, listening to Indigenous communities here and looking to some of those justice and conflict mediation systems that they had prior to colonization, because we've borrowed from that and had success. And so continuing to listen to folks in that regard is helpful as well.
Thank you so much for that. That, I think, is really good to pinpoint a few different pathways for strategies or preventative approaches. Also, what you said about looking to the past on some of the pathways and things that we've done previously is really important for us to be able to move forward, because there are things that we can pull from it. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. There are always elements that we can carry forward. So I really do appreciate those thoughts. And well, truly, I could sit here all day and ask you questions. I want to open it up just before we go to the Q&A. So if there's anyone who's listening who wants to ask a question, please put in the chat, the YouTube chat box. But I'll open it up to both of you, Dr. Whynacht and Dr. Rousseau, if there's any final thoughts that you had about our discussion or things that weren't brought up that you wanted to mention now. The floor is yours, and then we'll pass it to Soha Safraz for our live Q&A at the end.
Maybe just a small point, because we, India brought up the issue of intersectionality. So you remember that maybe that intersectionality is the fact that different forms of disadvantage, so gender, race, migration, economic status, and so on, handicap, can be cumulative. And it's the idea to think of gender as related to a lot of other forms of disadvantage. But recently, as a team and with our research data, we've come to consider that intersectionality very often in our society now is not cumulative, it's conflictual. It's both cumulative and conflictual, meaning that we have a different marginalized group which are opposing each other. For example, a religious group will oppose because it feels threatened. LGBTQ movements or rights, or women, or other marginalized group which are also object of racism and exclusion. And I think that in Europe and North America, populism have been fueling these divisions in order to preserve some privilege of the elite. And I think that we have to be very attentive in that in our prevention models. And I remember the woman in Guatemala when I was working with Mayan community in Guatemala. The woman movement would say, our movement is for our community. It's not against men. Even if sometimes they're drunk and they get violence, we have to look for a solution for all of us as a society rather than against. And I think that this to me is very important in terms of prevention. How in our prevention we think of suffering and distress beneath the violence. I think violence in my mind is very often a sign of weakness, not a strength. And how do we try to restore social cohesion? And that doesn't mean condoning or minimizing violence.
Thank you so much for those words. Social cohesion is really something that that is a big part when it comes to talking about violent extremism in communities and national or local. If there is anything that Dr. Whynacht wanted to add, it's open to the floor for you. If not, we'll pass it to Soha. No, you're all good? Okay, well then, Soha, I'll give you the floor.
Thank you so much, Selena, and thank you, Dr. Whynacht and Dr. Rousseau, for your amazing perspectives. We're going to go to the Q&A portion, so I have a couple of questions ready. The first is, violent extremism is often framed as an external threat. How does gender help us better understand radicalization and extremism within Canada? So this is open to both of you, whoever would like to answer first.
I can maybe jump in rapidly. It's interesting that there is, I don't want it to become complex, but there is presently a semantic shift, meaning that the category we thought were clear to us, like terrorism or extremism, have been rapidly shifting and presently they're being politicized in Europe and North America in unprecedented way. So let me give you an example. Around 9/11, usually when people were talking about extremism and terrorism, they were talking about an external threat. And the notion of homegrown terrorism had emerged much after. It's less than 10 years ago, I would say probably 6 in the US, that homegrown terrorism was recognized. So the fact, and that was difficult and is not present, and that's why we avoid the word, for example, in our work, radicalization, because it's so associated with religious extremism and Islamophobia that we avoid it because it's too connotated. Now, presently, especially in the south of our border, the use of the word extremist or terrorist are commonly used in the political arena to mean disagreement. So if somebody disagrees with me on whatever, the Middle East conflict or others, but certainly the Middle East conflict, but also social policies, political views, this person becomes a terrorist or an extremist. And so you see, this shifting field means we should be very careful with words presently, because there is a politicization of what is perceived as a threat. And this is building social polarization by increasing the gap among groups which have to live together. This is democracy. It's democracy is dialogue among dissent, not agreeing of everybody. But if we consider the other who disagree or dissent as dangerous, we divide our society. So your question is important because this is being mobilized presently, I would say, in dangerous ways.
Yeah, I think that's such an important point. At this stage of propaganda coming out of certain political leaders, that every accusation is a confession in so many ways, but the framing of migrants or newcomers as the source of any and every problem makes us have to take so much care in our language. I think I would answer the question on, when we think about extremism and terrorism as an external threat versus an internal one. I mean, of course, there's all the data on right-wing extremism being ultra-nationalist and sort of ultra-Canadian, here 150 acts of severe, like ultra-nationalist white supremacist violence in Canada since 1990. But also that strategic violence and acts of sort of what we call coercive control in a family violence context, that was key to establishment and maintaining colonial control over Canada, and it was perpetrated by the Northwest Mounted Police here. And so if we take a historical lens back at the founding of the Canadian state, the way that a small amount of colonists were able to amass control over large amounts of territory from Indigenous nations relied on the use of unexpected and strategic acts of violence to instill fear. And I think that, I always try to raise that historical perspective as well, not because I'm always, trying to make the state a bad guy when we think about violence, but because it helps explain, if we understand that certain logics of violence are embedded over hundreds of years in how we operate as an infrastructure, as a state, then it makes it we're easier on ourselves when we think about how hard it is to stop violence, right? It sort of makes us understand why it's such a stubborn problem and a difficult thing to uproot from our collective spaces.
Thank you for your insights on how violent extremism is framed as an external threat, and how gender can help better understand radicalization within Canada, and how embedded it is within within our state, especially surrounding the polarization of language. I thought that was very insightful. Thank you. The second question that I have here is, there have been instances in history and in the present time that show that women are not only victims of extremist movements, but can also be active participants, recruiters, and ideological actors, harming both other women and men in the process. Often, they engage in these behaviors as a survival tactic, while other times it might be for genuine ideological conviction. How do the pathways into violent extremism differ for women compared to men? And what does that mean for designing prevention strategies? Is it because of socialization under patriarchal systems? So yes, very great question there, I think.
It's a huge question. I would say, yes, women can be and are violent. But you know, we are mammals. Humans are. And think of the bears. A female bear can be very dangerous. You don't want to meet her when she has cubs. But she will not attack in the same way or for the same reason than a male bear. So women who are socialized in different ways than males, and of course we have to be very careful, as Dr. Whynacht was saying about gender stereotype and gender divide. There is, of course, a whole fluidity, but in general, women tend to be less aggressive and less violent, or aggressive in different ways, just like the bears, and exert their power in different ways. Now they can and they do enter violent extremist movement, which for the moment, those that I know are male dominated. I haven't yet seen female dominated violent extremist movement. I'm not saying that that cannot exist. I haven't worked in those settings. And in that context, where usually it's male dominated violent extremist, the common pathway for women, and we do have some woman client toward violent extremism, is often either isolation and the dream of a romantic relation, sometimes altruistic, ISIS recruitment in terms of altruistic motive, becoming a mother to refugee kids, to Syrian kids, was a big driver. So, which women are sensitive to, or as aftermath, and I see that a lot also, of abuse, with a form of identification with the aggressor and looking for protection. Also after some forms of grooming with young girls on social media and so on. So very often we are in complex victim-aggressor dynamics, but also relational and altruistic motive, more than narcissistic ones, are at the forefront of women engagement in CVE, in VE.
Thank you for that. Dr. Whynacht, if you have a perspective on that as well.
Yeah, I mean, so I come to this perspective after working for more than a decade in a women's prison, specifically in a max unit running psychosocial rehab programs. I underscore the assertion that, women can be very dangerous. And it's difficult to have in a context of misogyny. It's hard to have a conversation about women perpetrating violence because, on one hand, women are blamed for everything. And then to have the conversations about holding them accountable for harm that they've caused is really hard in the context of all the unfair blame that happens. But, I'll say my biggest concern right now in terms of, women's engagement in VE is around the issues of transphobia in feminist spaces. you know, seeing a lot of rhetoric on, kill your rapist, use bear spray on the trans creeps that come in the bathroom. You know, this is the horrible language that we're seeing all over the internet all of the time, endorsed by, you know, high profile women. And we know that, you know, again, we've known since Rwanda that, you know, broadcasting hate speech for long periods of time can lead to extreme violence. And so I think, you know, being critical of the role of influencers in all aspects of society, and then thinking through the connection to civil society and youth, and how much of a big task we have in youth serving organizations to help them be literate about and to develop resilience and resistance to the messages that these influencers are sending to their phones. Because, you know, Andrew Tate is very dangerous, but of course we have lots of women working as influencers, really changing hearts and minds in quite terrifying ways. And so, you know, I think those things, you know, strike me as being really important to talk about. And also about the fact that, you know, we have funding for rehabilitation and violence prevention often in women's prisons across Canada within the federal system. And we often don't have the same amount of money spent in men's prisons as well. And so, you know, I think a lot of the data and research about, you know, how women do when they're rehabilitated and recidivism when they engage in acts of violence has to be understood within the context of how little effort we spend in you know, doing the sort of work that Dr. Rousseau does. There's just not a lot of that work that happens in the formal systems that we have in punishment prosecution.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Yeah, I do think, especially in like online spaces, extremist narratives do target like men and women very differently. Like you have Andrew Tate on one hand, and especially on TikTok, you see the return of traditional talk that is being pushed on for women. And so gender dynamics do definitely shape radicalization strategies differently in online spaces for the youth as well. So one last question I have here is the women, peace, and security agenda have been widely adopted, yet implementation varies. What challenges arise when translating WPS principles into concrete PVE policies? If either or, if not, I have a different question. If this one's not really fun to answer, but I think if anyone has any takes on this,
Funding and political support. That's my simple answer.
Funding and political support.
Yeah.
Dr. Rousseau, would you agree with that? Any takes?
Oh, certainly resources are important, but I would say I find it difficult to have a kind of a broad answer. I would like to, it's a kind of question where you have really to, okay, let's sit down and consider which part of the policy. That's why I'm kind of saying it's a big question. I think it's an important one.
Right. Well, thank you. Thank you for that. Thank you for the incredibly insightful responses and for sharing your expertise with us today, especially after International Women's Day. Happy International Women's Day for everyone here. It's been an honor to help organize this event with Muskan and Selena, and shout out to the NATO Association of Canada for hosting this event and everyone who joined us in this meaningful dialogue. Your perspectives on gender dimensions on security and violence have given us a lot to reflect on, and we're very grateful for the depth of knowledge that you brought to this discussion. Thank you very much. And with that, I'll pass it back to Selena for the final remarks.
Yes, I'm pretty much going to reiterate a lot of what Soha just said, but thank you all to our speakers, to those listening live. Thank you for joining us with the NATO Association of Canada today. It was truly an honor to organize and participate in such an important event with impactful, deep discussions and insights. Taking place after International Women's Day, this event has been a moment to celebrate, but also to reflect and engage in meaningful discussion about topics that might not always be talked about, but are very important to the discussions of women and peace and security. And we hope that anyone listening in, can take what you've learned and what you've talked about and bring it forward into your everyday work and lives and modern discussion, daily discussion. So I have to give a very big thanks to our panelists, Dr. Rousseau and Dr. Whynacht. I appreciate so much that you're here with us today. You and your knowledge, your depth of work experience and lived professional experience is incredible for you to be able to share with us today. And also, I have to say a big thanks to Director Indira Naidoo-Harris for your wonderful introduction and participation with us in holding this event. So thank you very much.
And if I can just add my thank yous to all of you on behalf of the NATO Association of Canada's Board of Directors. I really want to tell both of you, our panelists, Dr. Whynacht and also Dr. Rousseau, your comments were thought-provoking and really filled with so much for us to think about and learn and think about in terms of how we build solid pathways to peace in the future. I found the conversation about internal and external terrorism or extremism particularly interesting, because I think a lot of times we wind up thinking about the external, but let's face it, these things can't happen without there being an internal component. And I thought both of you touched on that very well. In addition to that, when we talk about building pathways to peace in the future, you touched on this lightly, but I think it's an important thing to talk about perhaps in the future, but the role that hate speech plays, media and education, making sure that hate speech in terms of social platforms and things that our young people are being exposed to, in addition to the need, and I'm someone who is involved quite a bit in education, the need for us to keep working on making sure that our young people are developing a critical eye when they're viewing and reading some of these things is the only way forward if we want to talk about peace and how to do that. And of course, the unique role that women can play on so many different levels in terms of being consensus builders and also individuals who are uniquely tied at times to the conversations happening on the home front and with others in their communities, and the power that they can have to change the narrative if it's headed in the wrong direction. But all of this to say thank you. I apologize for going on. I was very, very energized by this conversation, and I feel we could go on about it for some time. Thank you so much for sharing your time with us. Miigwech.